July 24th, 1959. Moscow. The leaders of the world's two most heavily armed nations are standing face to face, surrounded by reporters, cameras, and Secret Service agents. They aren't in a war room. They aren't negotiating a nuclear arms treaty. They are standing in the middle of a model kitchen. U.S. Vice President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev are shouting at each other. The tension is palpable, but the weapons of choice in this standoff aren't intercontinental ballistic missiles. They are washing machines, color televisions, and kitchen cabinets. This is the kitchen debate. It stands as one of the most bizarre and defining moments of the Cold War. For decades, the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union was measured in nuclear stockpiles, space races, and proxy wars. But in this exact moment, Khrushchev realized something profound. To truly defeat the West, he couldn't just build more tanks. He had to beat America at its own game, the middle-class lifestyle. The Soviet leader made a decision that would alter the course of his country. He decided to import the American dream into the Soviet Union. He demanded mass housing, modern home appliances, and consumer abundance, all built strictly under the banner of a planned communist economy. This is the story of how an obsession with American domestic life completely transformed the everyday existence of millions of Soviet citizens, and how this massive, unprecedented social experiment eventually spiraled out of control, pushing the world to the very brink of nuclear annihilation. To understand why a Soviet leader would care so deeply about household appliances, we must look at the country Nikita Khrushchev inherited in the 1950s. On a macroeconomic scale, the Soviet Union was an unstoppable industrial and military juggernaut. It had played a decisive role in defeating Nazi Germany, successfully developed its own nuclear arsenal, and was rapidly expanding its influence across the globe. But beyond the grandiose military parades in Red Square, the daily reality for the average Soviet citizen was starkly different. For decades under the rule of Joseph Stalin, the entire Soviet economy was ruthlessly optimized for heavy industry and military might. Consumer goods were viewed as a secondary concern, bordering on a bourgeois distraction. The centralized state apparatus could seamlessly manufacture thousands of tanks, forge millions of tons of steel, and build colossal hydroelectric dams. But it consistently failed to produce adequate winter clothing, comfortable furniture, or basic hygiene products. The most severe and visible crisis was housing. Rapid urbanization in the 1930s, compounded by the massive destruction of World War II, left Soviet cities critically overpopulated. The state's primary solution was the kommunalka, the communal apartment. Millions of citizens were squeezed into subdivided pre-revolutionary buildings or hastily constructed wooden barracks. In a typical kommunalka, a family of 4 would live entirely in one small room, forced to share a single stove and one bathroom with 5 or 6 other families. Privacy was non-existent. Life was defined by cramped conditions, thin walls, and a perpetual struggle for basic necessities. When Khrushchev solidified his power, he recognized the fatal flaw in this system. In 1957, the Soviet Union stunned the world by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. They had beaten the United States into space, yet the very engineers and workers who made that triumph possible were returning home to apartments without hot water, standing in hours-long queues for basic groceries, and washing their clothes by hand in shared metal basins. Unlike many previous leaders, Khrushchev came from a working-class peasant background. He was a true believer in the communist project, but he also realized
that ideology alone could not sustain a superpower indefinitely. He understood that to prove the absolute superiority of communism over capitalism, the Soviet state had to deliver tangible, material prosperity. It had to show the world and its own citizens that it could provide a higher standard of living than the West. The government began to announce new ambitious plans to solve the housing shortage and flood the stores with consumer goods. But there was a critical problem. The Soviet planned economy had no blueprint for mass-producing domestic comfort. To outpace the United States, Khrushchev needed to understand the mechanics of capitalist prosperity. This set the stage for the cultural exchange of 1959, culminating in the Moscow exhibition and the famous kitchen debate. But Khrushchev wanted more than just a curated display. He wanted to see the American machine for himself. In September 1959, he made history by becoming the first Soviet premier to visit the United States. He framed it as a diplomatic mission, but in reality, it was a grand reconnaissance operation to inspect the American dream up close.
September 1959 marked a surreal moment in global history. Nikita Khrushchev's aircraft touched down in the United States, initiating a 13-day tour that was part diplomatic summit, part media circus, and part reconnaissance mission. For the American public, it was a chance to see the face of the enemy. For Khrushchev, it was a profound confrontation with the reality of American capitalism. The trip was filled with bizarre cultural collisions. In Los Angeles, the Soviet premier was treated to a lavish Hollywood luncheon, rubbing shoulders with stars like Frank Sinatra and Marilyn Monroe. But the glamour quickly turned into a diplomatic incident when Khrushchev was informed that due to security concerns, he would not be allowed to visit Disneyland. The leader of the communist world erupted in genuine anger, demanding to know if there were rocket launching pads or cholera outbreaks hidden within the theme park. It was a moment of dark comedy, yet it underscored a deep psychological truth. Khrushchev desperately wanted to experience the full spectrum of American life. Beyond the spectacle of Hollywood, the true impact of the trip occurred in the American heartland. In Iowa, Khrushchev visited the farm of Roswell Garst, a pioneer in hybrid seed corn. The Soviet leader, who had grown up in an impoverished agricultural society where famines were historically common, was absolutely mesmerized. He walked through fields of towering corn and inspected advanced farm machinery. He saw an agricultural sector that operated not through back-breaking peasant labor, but as a highly efficient mechanized industry capable of feeding millions with surplus to spare. The culture shock deepened when the tour reached San Francisco. Here, Khrushchev was taken to an everyday American supermarket. To a man accustomed to the Soviet system, where state-run stores suffered from constant shortages, limited variety, and hours-long queues, the sheer volume of goods was staggering. Shelves were packed with brightly colored packages, fresh produce, and a dizzying array of meats, all available through a simple self-service model. The Soviet delegation secretly suspected the store was a staged set, a Potemkin village built just to deceive them. This disbelief continued during a visit to an IBM manufacturing plant. The American executives were eager to show off their cutting-edge computers and electronic data systems, expecting the Soviet leader to be intimidated by their technological prowess. Instead, Khrushchev paid little attention to the computers. What genuinely captivated him was the company's employee cafeteria. He marveled at the self-service lines, the variety of hot meals available to ordinary workers, and the overall efficiency of feeding hundreds of people quickly and cleanly. These encounters fundamentally shifted Khrushchev's perspective. He saw that the true strength of the United States did not lie solely in its nuclear silos or its Wall Street banks. It lay in the staggering material abundance available to the average citizen. The American middle class possessed a level of everyday comfort that the Soviet worker could not even begin to imagine. Khrushchev left the United States with a complicated mixture of envy, admiration, and aggressive determination. He was now armed with a clear vision of what capitalist consumerism looked like. Upon returning to Moscow, he made a bold, almost impossible promise to his people. The Soviet Union would not just catch up to the United States, it would surpass it. He was going to build the American dream, but he was going to build it better, faster, and under the red flag of communism. To fulfill his monumental promise, Khrushchev launched the most extensive housing construction program in human history. If the American dream was anchored by the suburban single-family home with a white picket fence, the Soviet equivalent was about to be born in the form of a 5-story prefabricated concrete apartment block. Today, these buildings, affectionately and sometimes derisively known as Khrushchevkas, are often viewed by Westerners as the ultimate symbol of depressing, dystopian Soviet architecture. But to understand this era, you have to completely flip that perception. In the early 1960s, receiving the keys to a Khrushchevka was an absolute miracle for a Soviet family. For the first time in their lives, millions of people were moving out of damp basements, wooden barracks, and crowded communal apartments. They were given their own private front door, their own private kitchen, and, crucially, their own private bathroom. It was a spatial revolution. The state was finally granting its citizens the right to a personal, private life, hidden away from the prying eyes of neighbors and the collective oversight of society. But an empty apartment does not make a dream. Khrushchev understood that these new homes needed to be filled with the same domestic conveniences he had seen in the United States. Consequently, the Soviet government ordered a massive pivot in its industrial sector. Factories that had previously only manufactured tank parts, aviation equipment, or artillery shells were suddenly tasked with producing consumer appliances. A true consumer boom swept across the Soviet Union. The state began mass-producing refrigerators, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, and televisions. Many of these appliances were heavily inspired by, or in some cases directly reverse-engineered from, Western designs. The aesthetic of the Soviet 1960s began to closely mirror the American 1950s. Families started to gather around the warm glow of their own television sets in their own living rooms. They could preserve food longer, easing the crushing burden of daily shopping. Housework became partially mechanized, freeing up precious time for leisure and personal hobbies. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed like the impossible was actually happening. The Soviet Union was actively transforming into a consumer society. The standard of living was rising at an unprecedented rate, and the optimism in the air was palpable. The people truly believed they were on the verge of outpacing the capitalist West, not through military conquest, but through the undeniable comforts of a modern lifestyle. However, taking the aesthetics of the American dream and forcing them into the rigid, uncompromising framework of a communist command economy was a highly dangerous gamble. It was an experiment built on a fundamental misunderstanding of how capitalism worked, and it was about to expose the fatal, unfixable flaws of the Soviet system. You can steal the design of a refrigerator, but you cannot steal the laws of supply and demand. This was the harsh reality that brought the Soviet-American dream crashing down. Khrushchev attempted to transplant the results of capitalism without adopting the economic engine that actually produced them. He essentially created a massive national cargo cult, imitating the outward appearance of prosperity while missing the underlying mechanics. In a market economy, companies are forced to innovate and produce high-quality goods because they are competing for consumers' money. If a product is bad, it doesn't sell, and the company goes bankrupt. The Soviet command economy operated on a completely different logic. Production was dictated from the top down by central planners in Moscow, who set strict numerical quotas for every factory in the country. The goal for a factory manager wasn't to satisfy the customer. It was simply to hit the state-mandated target at any cost. This led to monumental economic absurdities. A footwear factory, ordered to produce 1 million pairs of shoes by the end of the year, would churn out identical, uncomfortable, and poorly designed shoes just to meet the quota. The result was that state-run stores were often filled with goods no one wanted to buy, while everyday necessities remained perpetually out of stock. The state could dictate how many televisions to build, but it couldn't mandate quality, variety, or efficiency. But the most devastating failure of this imitation game happened not in the factories, but in the fields. Khrushchev was still haunted by the memory of the towering, golden cornfields of Iowa. He became convinced that corn was the magic bullet that would solve the Soviet Union's chronic food shortages and propel them past American meat and dairy production. He launched a massive, obsessive agricultural campaign, crowning corn as the queen of the fields. Ignoring the fundamental differences in geography and climate, Khrushchev ordered local officials to plant corn almost everywhere. Vast tracts of land that were completely unsuitable for the crop, including regions in Siberia and the cold northern territories, were suddenly seeded with corn. Local party bosses, terrified of failing the premier's grand initiative, reported wildly inflated numbers and planted corn at the expense of traditional reliable crops like wheat and rye. The result was a catastrophic agricultural collapse. The harsh Soviet climate decimated the cornfields. Harvests failed spectacularly across the country. Instead of the promised abundance of meat and milk, the nation faced severe shortages of basic staples. In a desperate and humiliating turn of events, the superpower that had promised to bury the West economically was forced to start using its precious gold reserves to buy millions of tons of grain from capitalist nations, including the United States and Canada, just to prevent mass starvation. The illusion was shattered. The people who had just moved into their new modern apartments found themselves standing in long, exhausting lines just to buy bread. The Soviet Union could put a man in space, but it couldn't feed its own citizens without capitalist help. As the domestic dream turned into a humiliating nightmare, Khrushchev's confidence fractured. To hide this internal weakness from the world, he was about to make the most dangerous geopolitical gamble of the 20th century. As the domestic economic reforms faced significant hurdles and the promised consumer abundance proved difficult to achieve, the Soviet leadership had to address a growing disparity, not just in household goods, but in global strategic positioning. The optimistic idea of peaceful economic competition, which seemed possible during the kitchen debate, was quickly overshadowed by the harsh realities of the escalating Cold War. The Soviet Union needed to project strength on the international stage to compensate for its internal economic challenges. During this period, Khrushchev's diplomatic style became a focal point. Unlike the stoic and reserved Soviet leaders who preceded him, Khrushchev was highly expressive and unconventional. At the United Nations General Assembly in 1960, his impassioned and disruptive behavior, most famously the incident where he reportedly banged his shoe on a desk, became a symbol of the era's high tensions. While the West viewed this as erratic, from the Soviet perspective, it was a way to loudly assert that the USSR would not be intimidated or ignored by the Western powers. Simultaneously, the geopolitical fault lines in Europe were fracturing. The open border in Berlin had created a severe crisis for the Eastern Bloc.
Hundreds of thousands of East Germans, many of them highly educated professionals, were migrating to West Berlin, drawn by the higher wages and the functioning market economy. To halt this critical brain drain and stabilize the East German state, the Soviet and East German leadership authorized the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. It was a stark, physical division of the two systems, effectively ending the open competition in the city.
Beyond Europe, the arms race was intensifying. The United States maintained a significant numerical advantage in nuclear warheads and the strategic bombers needed to deliver them. Furthermore, the U.S. had recently deployed Jupiter medium-range nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy, placing them right on the Soviet border. To demonstrate that the USSR was not lagging behind in military capabilities, Khrushchev authorized the testing of the Tsar Bomba in 1961. It was the most powerful nuclear device ever detonated, serving as a loud declaration of Soviet nuclear parity. This search for strategic balance ultimately led to the most dangerous confrontation of the Cold War. Seeking to deter further U.S. intervention in Cuba following the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, and looking to create a counterbalance to the American missiles stationed in Turkey, Khrushchev made the decision to secretly deploy Soviet nuclear missiles to Cuba in 1962. For 13 days in October, the world stood on the absolute brink of a nuclear conflict. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the dramatic climax of the superpower rivalry. Ultimately, the crisis was resolved through back-channel diplomacy and mutual compromise. The Soviets agreed to withdraw their missiles from Cuba, while the United States publicly pledged not to invade the island and secretly agreed to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The immediate threat of war was averted, but the rapid escalation, from arguing over the merits of washing machines to navigating a nuclear standoff, illustrated how deeply intertwined domestic anxieties and global security had become. In October 1964, just 2 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Nikita Khrushchev was quietly removed from power by his own political party. The ambitious, boisterous era of trying to rapidly outpace the United States in the production of consumer goods came to an end. The Soviet leadership returned to a more conservative, traditional approach, once again prioritizing heavy industry, military parity, and stability over the unpredictable pursuit of the American dream. But the genie could not be put back into the bottle. Khrushchev's reign left an irreversible legacy on the Soviet landscape and the Soviet mind. The millions of prefabricated apartments, the Khrushchevkas, remained. They fundamentally altered the social fabric of the country. By giving people their own front doors, their own kitchens, and their own private spaces, the state inadvertently dismantled the highly collective, easily monitored society of the previous era. A private sphere had been created, and within that private sphere, a new set of desires began to grow. Here lies the ultimate paradox of Khrushchev's grand experiment. In his genuine attempt to prove that the Soviet system could provide a better life, he introduced his citizens to the concept of consumerism. He showed them televisions, modern appliances, and the idea that personal comfort was a legitimate goal. However, the rigid framework of the command economy could never keep up with the expectations it had raised. Over the next 2 decades, the gap between the state's promises and the reality of the stores only widened. While the Soviet military remained a formidable global force, ordinary people spent countless hours standing in lines for basic necessities. A thriving shadow economy emerged, where Western goods like blue jeans, cassette tapes, and foreign electronics became highly prized status symbols. the Soviet people were no longer comparing their lives to the hardships of the past. They were comparing their lives to the standard of living they saw in Western films and magazines. When the Soviet Union finally dissolved in 1991, it was not due to a military invasion or a nuclear strike. The superpower crumbled from within, exhausted by economic stagnation and a profound loss of faith in the system. The people were simply tired of the chronic shortages. They wanted a genuine consumer economy, not a state-mandated imitation. Looking back at the kitchen debate of 1959, the surreal argument between Richard Nixon and Nikita Khrushchev over washing machines and color televisions was not just a bizarre diplomatic incident, it was a prophecy. It revealed the exact fault line along which the Cold War would eventually be decided. The global conflict between two nuclear superpowers was ultimately settled not in the missile silos and not on the battlefields, but in the aisles of the supermarket and in the kitchens of ordinary people.